Appalachian Harvest is a food hub located in Southwest Virginia that provides regional herb and vegetable farmers with training, technical support, aggregation, and distribution services, connecting them to retail markets. We currently source produce from farmers in Virginia, Tennessee, West Virginia, Kentucky, and North Carolina. This webinar is made possible by Risk Management Agency 2018 Risk Management Education Partnership Program.
Basic question, what is organic or what is certified organic? Well, it's actually a labeling term. And what it actually means is that the product has been produced through approved methods. And actually, when we're talking about that organic label, it's not just organic. You may have seen out in the retail marketplace, 100% organic, organic, made with organic ingredients. All these are kind of different levels of organic certification. But the key to take away is it is not just an adjective to describe how something's been produced or how something has been made. It's actually a labeling claim. And by that, I mean just like saying something is fat-free. You wouldn't expect a product to be able to say that unless it was actually fat-free. So by the same token, organic actually has very specific meanings, and it isn't simply an adjective to identify it. It actually means something specific. Organic certification is actually a third-party certification program, and it allows producers to use that word organic as a label for their products. And what we mean by third-party certification is the people that are responsible for administering it are not either the producer of the product nor the purchaser. And what that means is they're independent of that process, and that independence allows them to be able to render a decision to make certain whether or not products are qualifying according to, in this case, the organic standards. The third party that we're going to be talking about is your organic certifier, and we'll talk more a little bit about what their role is in the process. And that certifier is actually accredited by USDA to conduct inspections and verify compliance with all USDA organic regulations. And that's how we get the third-party certification in this system. Third-party certification is very common within any number of different systems, whether you're talking about nursing to patient ratios in regards to hospitals or any other number of different industries. Third-party certification is typically viewed as the gold standard because there isn't a conflict of interest inherent to it. One question you may have is, why would a producer actually want to become certified organic? One of the number one reasons we see interest in organic certification is a buyer requires it. So Appalachian Harvest as a food hub is itself certified organic as a handler, and we sell to certain buyers who have consumers that want to purchase certified organic. And because of that, we ourselves are certified, and we purchase from certified farmers. So it's a specific market that is interested in purchasing organic, and that's generally the number one reason we see growers become interested. They find a market that is looking for certified organic product. Another reason is a producer may want to distinguish themselves from other producers. So if you're selling even direct to consumer at farmers markets or off the farm, you may want to distinguish yourself from any number of other producers. And one of the ways you can do that is by going through this certification process and allowing yourself to be identified as an organic producer and your products as organic. And the third way is something that I've actually ran across when working with some producers. There was one instance where there was a farm who was in a rural area, and they actually didn't advertise or promote their product as certified organic, although it was. And the reason they told me is that in their rural area, they were afraid that people would assume automatically their product was more expensive. So they didn't promote it. But they said they wanted to be certified organic to hold themselves accountable. They said that it was important to them for that to have that certification. So in some instances, it's market driven. In other cases, it may be about just your personal feelings on the systems. So whatever your reason, there's a number of good choices to become certified organic. One thing I will mention as we go through this webinar is you'll hear me talk about checking with the certifier or confirming with the certifier certain elements or certain things. The reason I say that is although there are, I think, currently 80 different certifiers across the world that administer the USDA Organic Certification Program, there can be slight differences in how they view certain elements. 95% of it will be exactly the same from one certifier to the next, but one may have a little bit different expectation when it comes to something such as what they would require to meet a certain standard. And so just understanding that there is some slight differences will help you not become confused. And so always talking with the certifier that you choose to work with is the key to making sure that you are going to meet that organic standard. But it's also important to say certifiers cannot consult with their clients. And what this means is if you call a certifier, you can't say, I have this disease on a plant, what can I spray? That certifier is not able to actually tell you those sorts of things. They're actually legally prohibited from it. What they can do is if you call them and say, I want to spray this product on my plant, they can tell you, yes, it's allowed, no, it's not. And so there is a line there that they're not allowed to cross. And that's why we see a lot of nonprofits that are out there across the U.S. that work on the education side, on that consultation side, because certifiers themselves cannot. And the reason is it's a conflict of interest if they're both telling you how to do something as well as verifying you are doing it. And so that's written into the regulations. And while it can sometimes be difficult for producers sometimes in finding that source of information, it is a way to keep that system free of conflict. So the very basic process on how to become certified organic is pretty straightforward. To begin with, the farm has to be having practices that meet the organic standards. And I'll talk more about the organic standards. I've said that several times already in this presentation, and we'll go into some detail so you better understand that. So once you have those practices in place, you would work with a certifying agent. So you can select any certifying agent you want to. We'll talk about maybe some tips that will help you choose one that might be best suited to your operation. And what you do is you submit an application or organic system plan to them, as well as certain fees. What happens is that certifying agent will review that submission, and if everything is in compliance, they'll go ahead and assign that file to an inspector. The inspector actually comes out and reviews your operation. It's an on-site inspection, and they'll confirm that what was presented in the submission is actually what's occurring on the site, as well as that records indicate even when they're not on the site, the same things are happening. That inspector will create a report. That report is reviewed by the certifier, and based on the determination of that review, you are either granted certification or possibly there are findings that have to be fixed, so to speak, non-compliances. We'll talk about that later in this presentation. And then ultimately, if everything's in order, you're actually granted the organic certificate. And that organic certificate is what allows you to utilize the organic logo, the label on your products. And it's important to note that this process is repeated annually. So it's not a situation where once you're organic and certified, you don't have to do it again. It actually is a process that recurs every year. And certifiers have slightly different ways they do that. Some use a set deadline every single year at the same time. Others have rolling deadlines depending on the individual operations. And so you may find a little bit of difference in that area. So I've been talking about organic practices, and we said that the first step in certification was to actually adopt and implement organic practices. What we're really talking about ultimately are the regulations that govern the organic program, because we can find those in the Federal Code of Regulations, Section 205, and you'll hear me refer to it most often as the organic standards. And essentially what these are requirements that are verified during certification. So there are both positive and negative things within these regulations, in that there are some things that operations must do, and there are certain things that they cannot or are not allowed to do. And so depending on the certain section, you'll see that reflected in some of the headings on that. While we won't go through every rule, certainly an hour is not long enough to allow us to do that, I do like to sometimes mention some of the misconceptions that are associated with organic. One of the things is organic is not all natural. And if we look to the regulations, section 205, 601, we actually found that we have a section that's headed synthetic substances allowed for use in organic crop production. So certainly synthetic substances are not all natural. And so it's important to understand that sometimes when we find producers who maybe choose not to go to certified organic production, we'll hear them using labels or terms such as, well, we're all natural or we grow naturally. But in all reality, that's not what organic actually is. There are provisions for synthetic substances in certain instances in certain ways. By the same token, not all natural substances are actually allowed. So 205-602 actually has the heading of non-synthetic substances prohibited for use in organic crop production. So there actually are natural substances that, because of their nature, are not allowed for production. So again, natural is not a synonym for organic. Organic is very specific, and it's based on the organic standards. Another thing we run across out in the marketplace is pesticide-free. There are any number of pesticides that are permitted for use within organic certification. They are not synthetic pesticides, so they're not the same ones that are typically used by conventional producers, but they are pesticides. And especially when you consider, in central Appalachia and our environment, if you're growing cucurbit crops, you're going to see diseases such as powdery mildew, downy mildew, things of that nature. And if you don't have a pesticide spray program, a fungicide program in place, you're going to see significant damage and loss associated with that. So again, organic is not about avoiding the use of pesticides, but it's using the correct pesticide in the proper way to see it most effective. One question is, well, do I have to be certified? And essentially is, if you're describing your product as organic, the answer is yes, unless you're a very small producer. And the way that that's defined by the organic standards is, if you're selling more than $5,000 gross of an organic product, then you have to be certified to be able to label that product as organic or to call your product organic. When you're under that $5,000 gross sales threshold, you actually are considered exempt from certification. You still have to follow all the very same rules and regulations, but you do not have to become certified. And what this is, if you're familiar with federal regulations, very often there are exemptions for the very smallest of entities that might be affected, and that is what this carve-out is. In my experience, occasionally producers will start at that less than $5,000 exemption level, but once they start having success, they very quickly exceed that. So typically, this is only your very beginning growers that are in this category, and they very quickly find themselves transitioning to certification. Because the difficulty is, once you have more than $5,000 of sales, you can no longer call your product organic. And so that is something to be aware of. The other limitation with this category of exempt from certification is that your product's not able to be used in another certified product. So for instance, if you wanted to sell to some blueberries to a baker who wanted to do an organic blueberry muffin, if your blueberries are not actually certified organic and not just exempt, then it wouldn't work, because when you're exempt, that certification doesn't follow through to the next product. So it is limited in where and how you can market your product. When we're talking about certification, we're focusing today on crops. And really that's to say the plants, but also when it comes to the larger picture, it's kind of the physical ground of an operation. And the reason we say that is, of the 4 categories that can be certified, things such as livestock would also require a crop, because those animals have to be essentially on physical ground that is certified, as well as their food products, etc. The last 2 remaining categories are processed products. This is also called handling within the regulations. And so it's everything from a produce aggregator and distributor, such as Appalachian Harvest, that just brings product in and redistributes it, all the way to slicing and dicing operations or even cosmetic companies. The final one, wild crops, is related to crops that are just harvested out of the wild. They're not cultivated, they're not tended, and so that's one that we see occasionally within our region, simply due to the tradition of wildcrafting herbs and things of that nature, but it's not something that is commonly seen. So again, we're focusing today just on crops and more specifically on produce. One common question that a producer will have is, does the entire farm need to be certified? It's a good question, and the answer is no. So you will have situations where the operation may have both livestock and vegetable production, and so it's not uncommon that the vegetable production may become certified, the livestock not, or vice versa. As well as you'll have, especially farms that are new to organic farming, they'll have some fields that are immediately available for certification, as well as those fields that have not yet met all the requirements. And we'll talk more about those requirements in a moment. So it's not a problem if a farm has some areas that are certified and some areas that are not. And lastly, it's even permissible for a farm to be growing the same product, both organic and conventionally. Specifically, that's called parallel within the world of organic certification. So if you were doing red slicing tomatoes, both as certified organic as well as conventionally, perfectly acceptable. You'd have to make your certifier aware of that. And as I state here on the screen, the operation may be subject to somewhat greater scrutiny, possibly. This is where it would come into play, because what your certifier would have to verify if you are growing as a parallel operation is that product isn't being diverted from the conventional production side and being sold as organic. And so it is somewhat more paperwork to make sure you have very clear paper trails associated with most of those products and making certain that it's clear which product's going where. But other than that, there's certainly no prohibition, and that's just something to be aware of you as a producer might have to meet. So what are some of the basic requirements that we find in the organic standards? The very basic one that we find is a 36-month transition period. So what does that mean? You'll hear this a lot in organic circles. What this literally means is any land or ground that you're going to be certifying has to be free from the application of prohibited substances for a period of 36 months prior to the harvest of an organic crop or product. And so we find this often that farms that did not necessarily intend to start their transition actually have. So it's not uncommon to find pastures that haven't been fertilized, haven't been seeded in a period of 36 months or greater. And so sometimes you can find land that's either been fallow or perhaps been grazed that actually meets this requirement and could immediately be certified. By the same token, typically if ground has been in active agriculture production for conventional crops, you're not going to find that it's immediately available for certification. And so you may actually have to go through the 36-month transition period. So it is important to note that this doesn't start necessarily the day you decide you want to be certified. If the previous 6 months meet that limitation that no prohibited substances were applied, you may be able to immediately get it certified if you can have records that verify that. So this is somewhat straightforward if it's property that you own and manage because it's been in your possession. You know what has or have not happened. So production records are very easy to demonstrate that. The one caveat I would say is oftentimes if it's fields that have been fallow, you may not actually have records because nothing's been done to them. And so in those cases, you'll see that an affidavit may be more appropriate. By the same token, the FSA 578 report of acreage forms, if you're familiar with working with your FSA office, those can be instrumental because they show what crops were planted on your farm and where. And also there's other documentation. So a statement or affidavit from previous managers or owners can sometimes meet those regulations. Again, different certifiers may have slightly different interpretations on what meets this requirement. But generally, when you have a clear paper trail and documentation related to what happened on that ground, you could possibly have it certified immediately if it meets that 36-month period. Of course, when the inspector comes out, they'll have to confirm that what they're visually seeing matches that history that you have reported. One thing I think it's important to mention, if you are in a situation where you have ground that is transitioning, I'd encourage you to think about working with NRCS in your area. It's a USDA Division Natural Resource Conservation Service. They actually will do conservation activity plans, and one of their approved practices is directly related to supporting organic transition. And what's good about this is within that program, there can at times be cost share for some of the activities that would help you become eligible for certification. So some of the things such as buffer areas and things of that nature can actually be included in this CAP plan, and there may actually be cost share assistance. Another thing that's good about this is if you have a CAP plan, it will actually substitute for some areas of the organic system plan or application that a certifier may require. So it's documentation that you can use specifically as you move forward to certification. Record retention, when it comes to organic certification, we have to keep those records for 5 years. And so it's important that you have some sort of system. It doesn't have to be paper, it could be electronic. It certainly doesn't have to be electronic. So whatever system works best for an individual producer is the one that they should use, but you do have to have those records available for 5 years. So keep that in mind as you begin to keep records for organic certification. So kind of looking at a 1,000-foot view on what are some of the things we're talking about, what are some of the things that are within these regulations that are methods that we have to follow. This statement here that you're seeing basically says that approved methods within the regulations integrate cultural, biological, and mechanical practices that foster a cycling of resources, promote ecological balance, and conserve biodiversity. And so there's any number of different ways that we can do this as producers. It's everything from crop rotations to utilizing cover crops, green manures, utilizing pesticides when necessary. Again, this isn't about never using a pesticide or being free from pesticides. There are certain instances where it is in the best interest of the farm and the crop to actually use those products. And again, making sure it's a product that is approved for use is of course important, but understand that organic production still allows for a whole host of different inputs, provided certain basic things are done first. We will say in general that non-synthetic or natural inputs are allowed, but again, that's not always. So there are certain things, such as rotenone, for instance, because of the possible deleterious health effects, it is no longer approved for use within organic certification. And so it's those sort of elements that, although natural, are not allowed. So if we talk about the approved and on the counterpoint, the disapproved practices. First off, there are actually 3 very big prohibitions. One of those is the use of sewage sludge, sometimes called biosolids. The other one would be the use of irradiation, and genetic engineering, or GMOs, may not be used. So sometimes when people are looking for GMO-free or other labeling related to genetic engineering, it's important to note that the organic label is already inherently that product. You cannot use GMOs in the production of organic products. Another one that is important to know for producers, you can't use treated lumber moving forward. So there is the ability for treating lumber that's pre-existing in an operation to remain, depending exactly on its situation. But you can't in the forward replace any lumber products with pressure treated or otherwise treated lumber. So that's important to know. And in general, again, synthetic inputs are prohibited, but we know from the earlier statement, looking at those organic standards, there actually are synthetics that are allowed. Very good example of this is the use of plastic mulch in production. So a large amount of certified organic vegetable crops are produced utilizing drip tape and plastic mulch. Both of which are clearly synthetic, but they're also allowed. But there are certain requirements, such as you have to remove the plastic by the end of the season. So you can't just till it in or anything like that. That is plastic that you would have to pull. So you just have to understand that there are some allowances for synthetics, but as a general statement, synthetic inputs are not approved. They are prohibited. Some of the things that are at the core base of these practices, crop rotation. Crop rotation is also one of the most easily remembered standards. It's 205-205. I've always hoped that whoever wrote that one purposely made it repeat, because crop rotation in itself is about not repeating crops one after another. So I hope someone had a good sense of humor and did that, and it wasn't just by chance. But that one I always remember. The other thing we need to pay attention to whenever we're producing a crop, if we're growing that crop, seedlings must always be certified organic. So they have to be coming from a certified organic operation. So we can't just buy seedlings locally necessarily. So that's something that you need to take into account if you're looking at planting for future crops. When we look at planting propagules that are not seedlings, so seed, bulbs, tubers, perennial plants, those have to be certified organic, unless first you can establish commercial unavailability. And then if it's commercially unavailable, it is possible to use untreated conventional products in place of certified organic. And again, this only applies to those plant propagules such as seed, bulbs, tubers, or perennial plants. Of course, the question is, what in the world does commercially unavailable mean? According to the definitions out of the organic standards, the commercial availability is the ability to obtain a production input in an appropriate form, quality, or quantity to fulfill an essential function in a system of organic production. And so basically what this means for most operations, a certifier is looking for you to be trying to source these plant propagules from at least 3 reasonable sources. I always say a reasonable source is a company that actually carries certified organic seed or bulbs, as the case may be. And if you can't find that specific variety available as certified organic, then most certifiers would allow you to substitute in untreated conventional products. I will say that what's very good about this is this allows for producers to use specific varieties. There are any number of different varieties that simply are not available on the market as certified organic. They're coming from smaller seed companies, and they just don't have the market demand out there. So, if you're looking for varieties that are adapted to your region, it's not uncommon to find a variety that performs well, but also is not available from a number of different sources. And those are ones that we're most likely to see unavailable in certified organic format. And so this is really in the benefit of a producer to have this flexibility. The one characteristic that is not allowed to be taken into considerations is the cost. So you will find, as a given rule, certified organic seed typically costs more than its conventional counterpart. But that's never able to be utilized as a determining factor for purchase. And so that's something just to be aware of. Understand that your production costs are typically higher when we're looking at propagule sourcing, and just work a budget that accounts for that. The other thing I think we need to spend a little time on is to talk about the phrase untreated, because untreated in organic certification actually means a little bit different than what we may think of in the standard terminology of the seed trade. Typically, if you talk about untreated within the world of seeds, people will think about the application of pesticides. So fungicide, insecticides are directly applied to seed. So if you ask for untreated seed, it wouldn't have these pesticides applied to it. And by pesticides, again, I'm talking fungicide, insecticides, things of that nature. However, with organic certification, we're also talking about things such as inoculants for legume seeds. It may be seed coatings that allow you to easier handle small seeds, or flow agents that are added to allow seed to work better in mechanical planters. All those things could be prohibited if synthetic in nature, or otherwise prohibited by the regulations. So it's important to understand that untreated basically means raw seed. There's nothing else added to it. Now, there are inoculants, there are seed coatings, flow agents that are permissible within or certified organic production, but they have to be specifically applied with that in mind. So again, generally speaking, make sure if you are buying seeds from a source, you can't find certified organic, make sure that untreated actually means fully untreated as the organic certification standards require. Another thing to talk about, and this I think is a good point, is when we're talking about production practices and inputs, Inputs can be fertilizer, pesticides, inoculants, and really any number of different things. We must always adhere to the NOP regulations and only look at those that are approved. And the question always is, well, how do I know if this product is approved? How do I know what I can and cannot use? The very best answer is ask your certifier. And the reason is certifiers either have their own approval process, or in addition to that, they may rely on some of the national review material organizations. The national review material organizations are not certifiers themselves, but they are entities that actually review and establish whether or not a product is permissible under the organic regulations. One of the big ones that people are most familiar with is OMRI, or the Organic Material Review Institute. That's a commonly seen label out there. There's also Washington State Department of Agriculture, California Department of Food and Agriculture are also two entities that are commonly recognized by certifiers. But again, this is where you have to ask your certifier. Some certifiers are very comfortable in saying as long as you use one of these listed products in a manner as they are approved for, it doesn't require additional approval from the certifier. Other certifiers absolutely require that you must notify them and add any new input product to your organic system plan if it's not already on there. So again, understanding what the expectation of your certifier has, whether they want to review everything you're going to use prior to use, or whether they're more lenient and will allow you to use directly off these lists without specific allowance, is up to you. So again, this is one of those areas where it's important to understand what that expectation is. And the reason it's so important to look at these input products is if we were going to try to do this ourselves as a producer, this is where we would go. So we actually go to the federal regulations, the organic standards, and ultimately we'd go to subpart G, which is the administrative, and specifically the national list of allowed and prohibited substances. So 205-600 is where it begins. It ends with 607. And so within these regulations are contained all the elements that would allow us to review and determine whether or not a product is or is not allowed. And let me tell you, it's not a simple process. It's very complicated. So here's a good example. So there are many potentially allowed substances that are perfectly capable of being used until something happens. And so that something happening may be there's a prohibited ingredient added, or perhaps it's from a different source. So it may be from a source that's disallowed. So let's take, for instance, gypsum. Gypsum from a mine source and used as a fertility product in crop production, perfectly acceptable. However, if that gypsum is actually sourced from recycled wallboard, it's not allowed. And we actually have in the agricultural retail world, there are products that are derived from recycled wallboard. So this is not an example of what might possibly be out there. This is actually an example of what is out there. If we even want to get a little more complicated, not just the source. If you take a mine gypsum product, which is perfectly acceptable, but they used a prohibited dust suppressant such as mineral oil in the production of it. So when they dug it, they ground it or sieved it to get to a certain consistency, and they bagged it. Oftentimes you'll find with mine products, they use some kind of dust suppressant. Oftentimes it's mineral oil, and that mineral oil is not allowed for application to cropland because it's a synthetic substance. So by adding that dust suppressant, we've suddenly taken a product that was perfectly acceptable and turned it to one that's prohibited. And the problem is you don't know any of this information just by looking at the product. It's not going to tell you on the label what dust suppressant was or was not used. It's not necessarily going to tell you what the source was. And because of that, it's a complicated process. And that's why I always encourage growers to always look at the allowed product list. Most certifiers, again, will have a list that they share with their clients of previously reviewed and approved products and source product off of those lists. Yes, certifiers can review new products. It does take time. So there's not a rapid turnaround always. So the best option for most producers is to start with that list of previously reviewed products and source product from there. So again, how do we know when gypsum's okay? We ask the certifier. And again, while we like these review organizations and they can be a very good first step in determining should this product be further pursued, it is not the be-all, end-all with every certifier. So again, make sure you understand what your certifier's expectation is. This isn't a good example of another thing we run into in the marketplace. So if you're an organic producer, could you actually use this product? Well, if we look at some of the terms on the label, we see, right up top, organic nitrogen. We're a certified organic producer, so that's sounding good. It has a little badge that tells us they're eco-friendly. Again, nothing wrong with that. We also see that for better results naturally. So again, natural, we know most natural things are actually allowed, and it says use everywhere. And if we even want to look further, we see that it's a bio-based product certified by USDA. So this is really sounding like something that would work well in an organic system. So the question is, can we use this? And the answer is no, because what meal orgonite actually is a fertilizer product that is derived from municipal biosolids. So biosolids is actually another term for sewage sludge. And if we remember back to earlier in the presentation, or back to the organic standards, 205.105.g specifically tells us that you cannot use sewage sludge in the production of certified organic products or a product that is derived from sewage sludge. So again, this is obviously not raw material. There's certainly nothing wrong with meal orgonite used as a fertility product in the general sense. But specifically for certified organic production, it is not allowed. And so this is where the complexity comes in. Fertilizer products and things of that nature do not fall under the regulatory overview of the National Organic Program. And the reason is they're not considered agricultural products. And that's why they could use that word organic in relationship to their product and say organic nitrogen and not run into a problem. So just because a fertilizer or some other input may say organic on it, you have to confirm whether or not that's indicating it can be used in organic production. So that is one complicating factor. And again, that's why I always refer back to your certifier and their approval process and any list they may look to. Another key point that we have to deal with on a certified operation is commingling. And commingling is basically defined as physical contact between organic product and non-organic product that could result in contamination. So we can see this happen at the production level, packaging, transport, storage, or handling. And it's important to understand that this is one of those key things an inspector is going to look at if you have an operation that is not fully certified organic. This is going to be something they spend more time on. For instance, one of the things we see is harvest containers. If you have both certified organic vegetables and non-certified organic vegetables, are you using different harvest containers? Or do you have some sort of cleaning step in between each harvest so you make sure those containers are always going back clean to the field? So most farms in this case will have different colored containers for certified organic versus non-certified organic. We as a facility, Appalachian Harvest, we have to be aware of our shared use equipment. We have some packing and washing lines that producers can come in and use. We have both certified organic as well as conventional growers. So we have to make a point to clean in between those growers to make sure that we don't have organic product following a conventional grower because that could result in a violation of commingling. And because of that, we have to take specific steps. So again, it's not that operation can't be both organic and certified and non-certified production. It's just that you have to take specific actions to ensure it doesn't create problems. In the same token, even if you are a completely certified operation, we have to still worry about contamination coming from elsewhere. So you will see buffer zones mentioned in a lot of organic materials. And basically what a buffer zone is an area located between certified production and non-certified production to prevent any sort of movement of prohibited substances from the non-certified area to the certified area. And generally, you're most worried about adjacent land. So it's, what's happening next door, what's happening on the other side of the fence. So things like overspray, runoff, and dust could all introduce contamination. And so we look at things such as, is there physically a large space between the certified production and the non-certified production? Are there windbreaks in place? Are there diversion ditches? Does just the topography of the general farmland allow for the organic certification, the organic certified crop to be above the conventional crop? All these things come into play. So there's not a way for us just to say, you need to have a buffer zone of X feet. It would be great if we could to simplify matters, but the reality is every single buffer zone is dependent on the exact situation. And so that's something that it's a good idea to consult with other growers or other folks that are familiar with organic certification requirements about what may be appropriate in your situation. Most of the time we are talking about reasonable distances, 25 yards, 50 yards, just depending on the exact concern. They can be minimal in size depending what's happening. So it's not where you can't use large sections of your farmland. I have seen where a certified neighbor works out an agreement with their conventional neighbor. Maybe they don't produce in that last drive row. They might ordinarily run their seeder through, so they're off that fence line further or things of that nature. So, lots of times these work out very easy for the certified operation. And so there are any number of solutions that can be implemented to help protect that integrity of the organic product. But buffer zones are something that every operation does have to think about implementing and determining whether or not they have to be used on their farm. This can even be things as simple as if you have an organic farm, but you also like that nice green lawn, and so you fertilize or you spray, you have to take that into consideration. Oftentimes, if a farm is utilizing electric fencing, they may be in the habit, if they're not certified organic, of utilizing herbicide sprays to maintain that electric fence so it doesn't short out on growth. Things like that are all things that sometimes a new person may fail to remember to implement a buffer zone in reference to. So this is something that it is important to understand why we have it in place to prevent that organic product from being contaminated. I've mentioned this before, and it's something that from time to time you will find a new producer that is surprised by this, but it is an annual process. So your certification is basically good for 1 year. Now, the way the certificates work, your certificate actually doesn't expire, and as long as you're in good standing and your certifier hasn't started an adverse action process against you, your certificate is still in good standing. But every year you go through the same process. So understand that and just expect that. So again, it's not where you have 1 year where you have the certification cost and then not again. You're actually going to have those sort of costs year after year. I will mention you can choose any certifier you wish. There are about 80 currently within the world that are doing certification. I encourage growers to price shop with certifiers. You will find there can be sometimes dramatic cost differences, and some of that is related to how far a certifier may be from you or how far their employee is. And it's important to understand that certifiers have different approaches. Some use flat rates. Others will use a certain fee for the application portion. And then there is a fee that is, directly related to the travel cost and time that the inspector spends in relationship to your operation. And then there are some that even assess a percentage fee on your gross sales. So understanding that there is a diversity of cost and what elements that a certifier may look at in determining your ultimate cost is important. So price shop with certifiers. Don't be afraid to have the conversation of what would it cost for me to actually be certified by you, and have that understanding so you're not surprised by it. One thing I always encourage with this process, and we saw these 5 steps earlier, start this at least 3 to 4 months prior to your harvest. If you contact most any certifier May 1, wanting to be certified for a crop that's going to be harvested in mid-June, it is going to be extremely difficult for that to happen. A lot of certifiers will try to do it. Some certifiers actually offer expedited service for additional fees in those sorts of situations. The best situation for you to be in with any certifier is to allow enough time for the processes to work through. The earlier you start the process, the earlier it is that they'll be able to get you lined up for your inspection and be there in time to properly certify you prior to harvest. So again, 3 to 4 months minimum. That means if you're looking at doing most crops, maybe start harvesting June 1, you're going to be wanting to look at latest, getting your materials into a certifier March 1, maybe even February 1. So that's just around the corner. It seems like the holidays always fly by. So just pay attention that the more lead time you give them, the better you'll enjoy the process and the easier you make it for your certifier. So how do we go about finding a certifier? One of the things we're going to be providing on our website within the next week after the conclusion of this is actually a PDF of all the different references we're going to mention here moving forward. But real quickly, the Organic Integrity Database, which is actually listing all the certified operations across the world that are certified by the USDA, actually has built into it a certifier locator. So you can see the address there, or if you search for an Organic Integrity Database, it comes up. Under the search tab, you find the locator. When you do that, you're able to actually go in and select the state you want to look at. So here we have Kentucky and Virginia up on our screen. You can see there circled in red the state box. Kentucky actually has 10 different certifiers that are currently certifying operations in that state. Virginia has 17. What you'll note is within the two states, the only certifier that is within either one of those is the Kentucky Department of Agriculture. So just because a certifier is not in your state does not mean they don't do business there. What you'll find is many of these certifiers use regional contract employees as inspectors. And so they may actually have someone to inspect your operation that's reasonably close by. So they're not necessarily sending an inspector from California or from Nebraska or wherever they may be. And so because of that, you can still have efficiencies and a low price associated with a certifier who may be out of state by some distance. So I would always encourage you, again, when you see this, you can talk to many of these certifiers, find out what sort of pricing structure they have. The other thing you can do is within the Organic Integrity Database is actually look and see who within your state is being certified. And so you can actually look and see what other crop producers, who are they actually using in your state. If there is a large number that are predominantly going with one certifier, there may be a reason for that. It may be the cost of the fees or the efficiencies, the turnaround speed. So sometimes talking to currently certified growers give you an idea of who you might want to use as a certifier. But again, these are available online and we'll have a link for you to click on those. One thing to mention about this process, we talked about it starts with an application that you submit to the certifier. These applications, more and more I see them referred to as applications and less as OSPs. OSPs stand for Organic System Plan. Whenever you start reading in the regulations and you see Organic System Plan, basically it says you have to create a plan that outlines everything you do on the farm and how it conforms to the regulations. I've been doing organic inspections since 2010. I would find that a daunting process. The good news is you really don't have to do it from scratch. The way certifiers work is they create an application process that is a template of an OSP. And basically, you just go through, fill out those sections that apply to your operation, and then you have that completed OSP for you to submit to them. So understand that, it looks daunting when you look at the basic requirements. Certifiers have done an excellent job of making it as easy as possible. You just have to go through, and sometimes we are talking about, 20, 30 pages of information, but it's straightforward. It's there for you to determine whether or not it applies to your operation. So generally, whenever we do these OSPs, basically you're going to be including some sort of payment whenever you submit that OSP. Maps are one that's very important. We'll talk about that in a moment. Previous land use documentation. If you remember talking about that 36-month transition, especially that first time submission, you're going to have to make sure that you have that well documented and established, and they need to receive that. The other thing is if you're going to be labeling products yourself. So in the crop scenario, let's say you're going to be putting some product in a clamshell that has a label on it and you're mentioning organic, or maybe you have a bagged product that you're putting a label on. You need to get those labels pre-approved before you ever use them. And I would encourage you to do it prior to printing, because there are some very specific requirements with labels regarding where things have to be in relationship to one another, so how they're actually laid out. And if you're unfamiliar with that, it's very easy to make a minor mistake that might make a label completely unusable. So I would encourage you to, one, look at available resources online to determine how do you create an approvable label. but also make sure you get that to your certifier well in advance of when you want to use it. That way they can review it, find if it's compliant or not, and you'll have time to make adjustments, and you'll not waste money printing a label that you can't actually use. Maps, as I said, they are important, and what's good about it is they can convey a lot of information to your certifier. So you need to make sure they're labels, and labels should correspond to the application field designations, or basically the names or numbers you're listing on that application. There's nothing more confusing than to have a map that looks like it's talking about a completely different area than the other documentation you have for a farm. So make sure that those line up and are the same. They don't have to be numerical. They don't have to be names. It's whatever you want it to be. Just make sure that they're consistently used across your farm operation. The other thing, buffers are important to include on a map. It shows, one, where they should be, so an inspector can easily confirm that. And also it just gives you a reminder that there's something that you have to maintain and be aware of. I encourage producers to look at using Google Maps or Google Earth. It works very well for this purpose. One thing I'll caution is sometimes if you're used to working with like the FSA office or other entities like that, they can generate farm maps for you. But often what you find is they create a stack of maps for you that is basically each field individually. That's good. It shows a lot of detail, but the problem is you end up with a stack of maps and no relationship on how they actually fit together as a farm landscape. So if you have multiple locations or if you have multiple fields, if you feel you can't put them all in one view and have good detail, have one overview map that shows all your fields in the area, and then maybe have zoomed in maps that then show more detail. Because not knowing how fields fit together in the farm landscape make it difficult for a certifier to understand what's going on. So here's a couple of hints. One, I always encourage producers to provide written instructions or directions to the site that the inspector is coming to. Sometimes you may be using a home address on your paperwork, when in reality they need to go to the farm address. It's not uncommon for GPS or online maps not to get you to the right site on a road. Oftentimes they'll get you to the correct road, but it's 10 miles down on the wrong end. So I encourage you always give written directions to an inspector, because again, one of the costs associated with organic certification is the inspector's travel time. So the more time they spend trying to find your location, the more time that you're going to be paying them for. Another thing, records are important to have on site, because when an inspector comes, they're on that operation for one day. It's a snapshot in time. And it's great for them to see that things are being done properly and as they should be. But what they have to also confirm is those days when they're not there, they can confirm the system is the same. You're going through the same sort of processes, you're doing the same sorts of things, and you have records that demonstrate that. And that's why records are so key. And lots of times what might happen is you do have a farm site and you do have the home site. And so an inspector shows up and you don't have the records available to them because they're back in the office or they're out with the accountant or any number of other situations. Anything like that is just going to make that inspection day longer. And again, when you're paying for that inspector's time, that adds up. And by the same scenario, have your records organized. Yes, you can dig through a box or a drawer or the dashboard of your truck. But the reality is the more organized you are, the faster the inspector can actually do their job. And also, when you walk into an operation and it's well organized, you have a better feeling that what you're seeing that day, that they have a system in place, that they're following it. It's kind of human nature. When you go in and things look disorganized, you have more concerns because you're not sure whether or not this operation is able to follow their plan that they've set up. One key thing I do want to mention, and this is important, inspectors never make the certifying decision about your operation. Part of this goes back to wanting to prevent conflict of interest. So, if you have an inspector on your farm, you can bribe them all you want, but ultimately they don't make the decision on your certification. And of course, I know no producer would ever do that. But what is important is that decision lies with that certifier. And so it does create that separation that I think is good, and it helps prevent, just a conflict of personalities. Not every two people that get together are going to like each other. Well, this helps prevent that from being an issue. And again, the other problems you sometimes run into is an inspector tries to be too helpful. So an operation really shouldn't be implementing practices simply because the inspector says they should. The inspector, one, doesn't have the authority to make that call, and two, they're basically breaking that fundamental rule of consulting with their client. So you can't consult with your farm that you're inspecting as a consulting client because, again, you've created that conflict of interest. So sometimes I've seen where a farm may implement a certain practice or do certain things because they said, well, last year the inspector said I needed to do X. The inspector can never make a requirement of an operation because they are not there in that role. They're there to collect information and return it back to a certifier who makes decisions like that. So ultimately understand the role of the inspector. And when you have an inspector that is saying you need to do this, you need to do this, maybe best just to nod your head, but understand that in their role, they do not have the authority to require anything of you. They're there to collect information and return it back to that decision maker. So, why do we want records? What are those records? And can there actually be benefits to you? Well, again, I've already mentioned it. Because that inspector is there in a snapshot in time, records demonstrate that what they see you doing right is part of a system that's always in place. So we can look at the regulations at those organic standards and say 205-103 goes into detail. 1.A, a certified operation must maintain records. So there is no option. There's a must there. We must do this. The other thing that I love, B1, those records must be adapted to the particular business and the certified operation. So what I love about that is there's not one form that you have to use as a requirement. You need to create records that are adapted to your business that work for what you're doing. So for some folks, that's going to be paper records. For others, we're talking electronic. So there's nothing wrong with either system. But those records have to fully disclose all activities and transactions of the operation and be in sufficient detail to be reasonably understood and audited. And we'll talk more about what sort of audit we're talking about. This isn't literally a financial audit that you may be familiar with, but it has the same principle. So we'll talk some about that. Again, we see in point 3 the mentioning of 5 years of retention. And the biggest thing we need is be sufficient to demonstrate compliance. Because again, these records are showing that yes, there's a system in place, it's being followed, and even when that inspector isn't there witnessing, it is following those standards. And lastly, they have to be available for review and inspection. So you do have to make those available when requested by the appropriate representatives, such as your certifier. A reasonable time frame probably would be 24 hours. So normally, if you're on an inspection and you can't find a receipt for something or things of that nature, most certifiers will allow that to be submitted within a reasonable time frame of a day or two, because it happens. You lose a piece of paper, you've got to contact who you purchased an input from, or you have to figure out which file you stuck it in, because obviously you didn't stick it in the right one. So again, certifiers are not unreasonable, but you do have to make those records available upon request. So, excuse me, what are we talking about when we mean records? What an inspector comes to a farm wanting to do is basically to conduct 2 different things. One of those is called a traceback, and the other one's called an audit. And again, a traceback starts with sales and works backward through the operation, looking at harvest, production, and inputs. So you as a certified operation want to look and say, is there any gaps in my record keeping? Are there areas where I need to do a better job? Because gaps provide ambiguity, and that's not what the inspector wants to see. They want to see a complete picture. The audit portion then takes basically the information they gain by going through that traceback and determines feasibility. So for instance, did you purchase enough seed to actually plant that much acreage? Is the yield appropriate, or is it some astronomical number that may actually indicate that there's something amiss with the operation, maybe sourcing product from somewhere that they aren't revealing, those sorts of things. So again, both of these all relate back to records, and these are the sort of elements that they're looking for. Here's a couple actual real-world example of records. This is from a livestock operation, but still very instrumental as an example. For instance, here we see where the farmer is listing a grazing record, so it shows us where cows are located, where they're grazing. He's showing that he hauled and applied box stall manure on certain fields, and he's talking about his harvest, his baled hay bales. All that information are the sort of things that an inspector looks for. This sort of record keeping on a calendar is actually very good and excellent, and it's very simple. This didn't require a computer. This didn't require anything. Most of the time you see records like this with operations, they complete it at the end of the day. It's not something that you have to do in the moment. It is something that lots of times it's helpful to do it at the end of the day, and oftentimes that helps maintain the legibility. Yes, you can keep a calendar or other records on the tractor or in the truck, but lots of times they really look well worn by the end of the season. So sometimes having a place back at the house where you actually do the final record keeping is important. Another example here, here's a farmer doing, again, records on their fields, a different farmer, a different method. They didn't use calendar, they just used a notebook to do things through. You'll notice on the side he has each field separate. That's perfectly acceptable. Some people prefer to do all fields together sequentially. It's whatever works best for them. Either way, it can be audited. That same farmer also has an equipment cleaning log. So we're talking about cross-contamination or commingling between certified organic and non-certified organic farms. If you're sharing equipment, which is very common in any number of different communities, and you have a piece of equipment that's coming from a farm that is non-certified organic, you need to have an equipment cleaning log that documents how you clean that product. So for some things, we're talking about washing. For some equipment, that's totally inappropriate. So things such as blowing out with compressed air, sweeping, and things of that nature are more appropriate. So again, this is that record for that. Here's a very simple but elegant way to make sure you have all the records you need. This is for a seed purchase. Apologize for the blurry photo. But what the farmer actually did is he saved the seed tag off of the product. And what's key about that is that allows a certifier to trace that seed by lot code or lot number. And so we can actually contact, as a certifier, the company that produced that seed, and they can tell us all the details about what was on that seed, what inputs may have been attached or coded. Was it truly a conventional seed that was uncoded and otherwise permissible for production? In this instance, you'll see actually the Omri logo there large. That's because this particular seed, I believe, had a seed coding that was allowed and was actually an Omri listed seed coding. The other thing that I actually love about this receipt, the sales entity actually put the lot numbers for each seed on the receipt. That's not something that's commonly done. This was one supplier that did that, and it was absolutely an easy way to track that seed. Not commonly seen, but was very much appreciated that the seller actually took the time to do that. So we've been talking a lot about all these different requirements. So the inspector comes out, they go through the inspection, they go through the farm, and what happens if something is not quite as it should be? What ultimately results if, upon review, that final reviewer sees that something is not compliant, you would receive ordinarily a notice of noncompliance. And what a notice of noncompliance literally is it's a notice that says something is not in accordance with the regulations. Generally speaking, most noncompliances are correctable. So your certifier will typically give you a specific period of time to respond to them. So sometimes the response may be to rebut it. Maybe something was misunderstood by an inspector, or maybe they just simply got something wrong. Maybe it was something you need to provide back to the certifier. Maybe you didn't provide back missing receipt or other information. But whatever it is, there is a specified period of time for you to respond. If you don't, there are other steps that then happen that could ultimately result in you not being certified, or if you are currently certified, actually being revoked so that you no longer are. But again, those are actually fairly uncommon. What we see with non-compliances quite often are things such as lack of records, sometimes the use of non-organic seed without establishing that commercial availability that we talked about earlier, failing to submit application materials or things like that by a deadline. So generally, most noncompliances in nature are rather simple and easy to correct, and you can do that and move forward. But again, if it's something more serious, something more fundamentally wrong, you could ultimately proceed to other elements of what's called the adverse action process, and not be certified or have your certified revoked. But we're going to assume that there's either no noncompliances or that we've actually resolved any existing noncompliances, and then you would be issued an organic certificate by your certifier. And so this would allow you then to market your product as certified organic. One thing that you need to be aware of, most buyers are going to be interested in having a physical or electronic copy of your certificate. So I encourage you to make copies of that, or make sure you know where you save it on your computer, because that's something, as you work with multiple buyers, you may have to provide that to multiple entities. Again, that certification process basically gets a little bit simpler in subsequent years because you're not having to submit quite as much information. Because once you have fields that are certified as organic, provided you don't remove them from your certification process, they continue forward. So that's less information you submit about the eligibility of those fields. So real quickly, I know I'm a little bit over time from what I intended, running through some resources that I think are very instrumental for growers to take a look at. Among those, USDA has a large number of resources available for those interested in organic certification. Some of them are extremely helpful, I think, for beginning that process of, do I want to become certified? So they do a good job of lining out the basics and help walking you through that process. They have PDFs of any number of different publications. They have videos. They have some interactive things where you actually go through and make selections and answer some questions, and it plays out certain scenarios. Another, I think, absolutely important source would be your certifier's website. So if you reached a point that you know who's going to be your certifier, many certifiers have a number of different resources for their clients that walk them through what their expectations are of those clients and any number of different other elements that would be useful to operations. So make sure you're taking advantage of what your certifier has to offer. You may want to talk to them and ask them what's best for me to look at. Another resource I greatly like is ATRA, which is part of NCAT. They have a number of different production type resources and publications that are great for organic growers. Two that I really want to highlight this evening are the Guide to Organic Certification, as well as the Guide for Organic Crop Producers. What I like about these two is they take the organic regulations and try and do a very good job of applying those in context of on the farm. So they try to make them more easier to understand and more in reference to situations, which I think they do a good job with. Those were produced, I think, in 2012, I believe, if I'm not misremembering. So they're getting a little dated, but still the key core components of organic certification have remained the same. And so ATRA is an excellent resource, those as well as many others. E-Extension, if you're not familiar with that, they have a number of resources as well, including videos. They can be a good resource. The USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, I highlighted here specifically the East National Technology Support Center, because they have a very good YouTube channel that has a broad range of resources regarding soil fertility, cover cropping. I will caution, not everything they bring up would be acceptable in organic certification, because it is broadly written to include conventional agriculture. But things such as soil health are universal. So maybe some of the direct techniques can't be used, such as non-selective herbicides as a burn down for a cover crop. Organic grower may use a roller crimper to kill that cover crop. If you have no idea what I just said, I encourage you to take a look at some of their videos on cover cropping. They actually have a really neat video. It's called Undercover Farmers. I think it's about 30 minutes long, and it does a great job of introducing the ideal multi-species cover crops and why they're valuable. By the same token, USDA has a large number of videos, some of those specifically related to organic certification. One I want to highlight is what to inspect on an organic vegetable farm inspection. You'll notice the two examples I have on the screen, both are part of the Organic Sound and Sensible initiative that they did a few years ago. So if you get on YouTube and look for Organic Sound and Sensible, you can find a number of different topics. But I like both of these because they use real-world examples to give you what the expectations are of organic certification. One last resource I'll mention is SARE, which is the Sustainable Agriculture and Research Education entity. They do a lot of grant work and things like that to promote sustainable agriculture, which does include but is not exclusively certified organic. They also have a number of different resources, such as books. Those books you can purchase outright. They have things on cover cropping, on using cultivation to control weeds, things of that nature that are directly applicable to certified organic production. And while you can buy those, they're also available for reading or download for free. So it's a great way to get some excellent material at no cost to you just by using your computer or your smartphone. Lastly, I'll mention regional conferences. In Kentucky and Virginia, I think we have two very good options. The Virginia Association for Biological Farming has an annual conference. It's coming up in January 2019. And the Organic Association of Kentucky has a conference coming up in March 2019. Both of those are excellent and geared directly towards sustainability and organic production. So they are very good for beginning or experienced growers that may be interested in learning more. So in summary, the way I like to think of organic certification is it allows for a producer to find a market and a consumer that recognizes the efforts they take on their farm, and it distinguishes their product from others out there in the marketplace. And what's good is there are any number of different resources out there to help you achieve certification. So I want to encourage you, if you have an interest in organic certification, that you pursue some of these resources and see what may be available to you.